and welcome to Senior Moment. My name is David Reffsin. I am your host for the show. Senior Moment is about seniors and for seniors. I am very pleased to have as my guest today Stan Rosenberg. Stan is a political activist. He is also the past president of the Massachusetts Senate. I want to also mention that Stan has a show on Amherst Media called Byline. Stan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm a little bit nervous here because, did you just say seniors? This makes me a senior citizen?
Not necessarily.
No. Actually, I'm quite long into being a senior citizen, but I'm not used to hearing somebody say that.
Well, the title of the show is Senior Moments, so,
yeah.
We all have that.
And we definitely have senior moments.
There's no question. So it does happen as we get older, which
but
is
I
kind
forgot
of
about that I was a senior, so that was a senior moment.
Well, the first notion I got of it, and it wasn't really the real thing, is the day you turn 50, how you get your notice from AARP.
Oh my gosh!
Literally the day.
I was so angry, and and it went on for years.
I know. But I'm going 50 and already I'm retired.
Yeah, they want me to pay for this membership and call myself a senior already.
I know. So I joined for a while. I had some good things, but
I thought about it for the movie deductions or cheap movies, except it always says 65.
Right. I hear you. I passed that mark a while ago. So let's talk a little bit about some of the early years, especially in college. Where did you go? I think it was UMass.
UMass, yeah. I was admitted to a number of colleges, but it was the only one I could afford to go to because I was coming out of the foster care system at 18 in those days. You became independent, unlike today where they'll pay for college if you've been in the foster care system. You were on your own, and so I had to get financial aid and work, and the only place that I got the appropriate aid and opportunity for work study was here. So I came here.
It sounds like a good idea.
I made a great decision coming here. It was wonderful.
And as you well know, as the years go by, this is really one of the top universities in the country.
Better and better every year.
Every year.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. Yeah. And they have the Honors College here as well. They put into effect a number of years ago. So it's quite an institution. It's getting really accolades for a lot of the things they do.
It's a bargain compared to what you're getting, and the value of the degree keeps going up and up and up because the quality of the place and the reputation goes up and up. And so, yeah, it's a great place to get an education, and it's a great value for the dollar.
So what did you actually major in when you were?
I majored in virtually every science. I virtued in everything except for science, and I finally got my degree in community development and arts management through continuing education, because I ended up going to school part-time and working full-time in order to survive. And so I switched over to continuing ed. It took me 10 years, but I got my bachelor's.
That sounds like a familiar tune. I'm kind of in the same boat. It took me 7. I had to work full-time and go at night, so I really understand.
Well, it was generational. A lot of people in our generation.
It's really true.
Yeah.
I couldn't afford not to work. I had to work. Yeah. And so I was going at night and try to fill it.
Not that there aren't a lot of kids now who struggle and also have to work and et cetera, but there's it was a fairly routine when we were going through.
It was. So when did this idea of sort of political activism and volunteer work, how did that get started? When did it get started?
So there were a couple of things. The first is that Professor Jerome Miller from the Political Science Department, he passed a couple of years ago, but he was chair of the Amherst Democratic Town Committee, and he had met me along the way and said you ought to get involved in the committee. And I toyed around with it a little bit, but not very much, and it just really wasn't my thing at the time, and because I was still going through school, et cetera. And then along the way, I finally decided to do something. So I came back to the town committee, and I had heard that Ted Kennedy was going to be running for president, and so I said, well, I've never worked on a campaign, maybe this is the one. And I found out that John Olver, our former congressman, at that time was our state senator, and he was the volunteer coordinator for Western Mass. So I called and I volunteered, and he put me onto some typical volunteer projects, and I started to catch the bug. And then at some point along there, I decided it was time to leave UMass and my position there. And I called him and I said, I'm going to be available full-time starting February 1st throughout the rest of the primary, so put me to work. And he said, really? And then he asked me, had you ever thought about working at the State House? And I said, matter of fact, I had. And I talked with Jim Collins about that, our former state representative, a number of years before that. And Jim said, you'll know if you like politics by working at the State House. Paid or unpaid, you'll figure it out very fast. And John offered me a job. I took it. So
with working for him?
For him at his Senate office. So when I left February 1st, was when I left the Friday before February 1st, was my last day of work at UMass. My first day at work at the State House was February 1st.
Just to go back a little bit about the Kennedy thing, did you ever get to really talk with him, meet him?
Never.
So this was strictly...
At that time.
Right.
I mean, I did years later, but yeah.
But so basically it was really working volunteerism on a state level.
Totally volunteer.
On a state level.
Yeah.
So here you are, you're working with John Oliver, and I'm sure that was a pretty interesting experience, to say the least.
Yeah, and within 6 months I knew this is what I wanted to do.
Really?
And it was a good job. I did press and community development for him, and then eventually became his chief of staff. At that time, they were called administrative assistant. We have grade inflation. We also have title inflation.
We sure do.
Everybody has to be director or deputy director of something.
Right. Well, chief of staff sounds pretty
now,
impressive.
Old chief of staff is just, it's really head in the clouds.
Right, to say the least. So you obviously decided that once you started working for John that politics was for you.
Yeah.
Now, how did it come about that you decided to run for the state legislature? Was it through his influence?
Well, Jim Collins was, let me give you a little bit more.
Sure.
So I worked for John over 4.5 years, and then I was recruited by the Democratic State Committee to be their deputy director and their first field director in decades. And so I worked on that next election cycle. At the end of that, Congressman Chet Atkins, who was the chair of the Democratic Party, offered me the job of district director in his congressional office. So I took that and I did that and was planning to stay with that for a long time. And what happened next was Jim Collins, who was the then state rep, was a candidate for the chancellor of the Board of Higher Education.
Okay.
And I decided, because the decision on that position was going to cross the period of time when you could gather signatures to be on the ballot, which meant Jim would be on the ballot for re-election. There'd presumably be no other candidate.
Right.
If he got the job, then he would not be able to take the job on the ballot, and it would be an election, a purely write-in election. And we just saw that when I transitioned out of the Senate. It's not a good way to do business. So I called Jim and I told him that I was going to put my name on the ballot, but if he didn't get elected, I would withdraw. Sorry, if he didn't get the chancellorship, I would withdraw. He got the job, I ran, I got elected.
Were you still on, was still a write-in at that point?
Was it still a write-in? No, because I was on the ballot.
Okay, so you actually formally...
And there was a Democrat, that was me, and there was a Republican, I'm blanking on his name right now, but there was a Republican on as well, and he withdrew because his father passed after the primary, and he said, I'm not going to campaign. So he withdrew, and
therefore it was pretty automatic. We're talking, what, middle 80s, late 80s at that point?
86.
Okay.
And I was sworn in 87 on the first Wednesday, and I was sworn at on Thursday.
Did you get...
That's a joke.
I got it.
Yeah. Not a very good one.
No, it's good.
All
it works
okay.
fine. Now, automatically you get signed to committees right away?
In the House,
yes.
You get signed to committees. You don't chair a committee. In
right.
the Senate, you will chair a committee when you go to the Senate because there's only 40 members, and so everybody gets a chairman.
So what did you work on in terms of the committee?
Education and environment were my top two.
This is in the House.
In the House,
right.
in my first term, and I was lucky enough to get on the Education Committee and also Environment. My big issue in the environment was going to be recycling, and I partnered with two other freshmen, and we got the first statutory language with regard to recycling in state law. And at that time, we were recycling about 5% of our waste. As a result of the policies that we were able to craft and get into the law, within a very few years, we were at 40% recycling.
Wow.
And then in education, I focused obviously principally on UMass because the Amherst senator and representative have to carry the flagship banner.
Sure.
And so in that first term, my major accomplishment was getting the House of Representatives over the objection of the Ways and Means chair to do their first major capital outlay bill for higher education, academic and other labs and buildings. So the building program, and we got $187 million approved, and that was over the objection of the Ways and Means chair. And once I got the bill through the House, John was able to shoot. It's like, phew.
So it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, back in those mid-'80s, as money got into UMass, it seemed like maybe that was the start of the prominence of UMass, perhaps, not quite, but...
Well, let's just say that in the early 80s, in the late 60s, when it went from 8,000 to 20,000 students, closer to 24,000, it was becoming the university that it should have been. And then there was a sort of plateau period, and Jim Collins and John Olver kept, the funding going for, meeting this new size school and helping to improve the quality, but it was kind of plateauing at that point. And then in the mid-'90s, it started to climb again. And again, I was in the late 80s, it started to climb again, and I was in the House and John was in the Senate, and then it just kept going. And I was fortunate enough to become the Ways and Means chair in my third year in the Senate.
That's a powerful,
which gave me the opportunity to boost higher education funding.
Right.
And for the 3 years I was chair Ways and Means, an average of 7.7% increase for the UMass budget, which was like twice the size of the previous increases year by year.
Right.
And so the university was really able to make another big move.
Well, it seemed, too, that, look, this was the flagship university, and I can't see them letting it go. They wanted to build it up for national recognition, but in state recognition that we're a flagship university.
Yes, it's important to differentiate the campuses within the system.
Right.
And you can't afford 5 flagship campuses in a state of 7 million people.
Of course not.
So the oldest and the largest campus was, from the beginning, the flagship, but it wasn't recognized. Right. And one of the accomplishments in the mid-'90s was I was able to get in the statute for the first time in history designating Amherst as the flagship campus. That was a major, out of sight, out of mind accomplishment, but it was significant for the campus. They still struggle to get the respect that a flagship deserves, but at least they have the law on their side now.
Right, and look what's happened as a result. I mean,
yes.
It's just out of curiosity, just going back to the House for a minute, and I should never assume anything. It was a Democratic-controlled House?
Both House and Senate, 90%.
Right, okay, so that helps a little bit.
We are very much a one-party state in the legislature.
Right. Okay.
It causes some problems,
Yep.
but it also has benefits if you're in the majority.
So at some point, you've been in the State House, House of Reps for a while. What made you decide to run for Senate at that point?
Silvio Conti, our longtime congressman, passed. John Olver ran for the Senate to fill the vacancy.
Right.
It created a vacancy in the Senate when he won. I ran with Dave Musanti as the other Democratic candidate. He was the mayor of Northampton.
Right.
I won 60 out of the 63 precincts. The 3 precincts I lost were 3 of the precincts in Northampton, but I won I don't know, 7 or 8 precincts there, and there was a Republican candidate who was extremely conservative and therefore out of step with the majority of this district, and I got elected and became chair of the Election Laws Committee. Then President Bill Bulger called me in. He said, "What would you like to chair?" And I said, "Ways and Means." And after we both stopped laughing, he said, "No, really?" And I said, "Well, I've looked at what's available, and the only committee that I would like to chair would be election laws, but you'd be crazy to name me to election laws because I think we need to make some changes." And he said, "Thank you, I'll think upon this," and called me a week or so later, and he said, "Congratulations, I'm naming you chair of election laws today." And in my term as, I was chair of election laws 1.5, 2 years, and yeah, about 2 years. And the 2 accomplishments were state-based campaign finance reform, which when we finished was declared by Common Cause as the toughest state-based campaign finance laws in the country. And voter registration laws. We were among the 10 worst states in the country for registering to vote, and the federal government passed motor voter, which meant you had to be able to register to vote when you go to the registry of motor vehicles.
Right.
And I went to the Senate President. I said, "We have to come into compliance with the federal law." He said, "Put a bill together." And when we finished that bill, we were in the top 10 in the country in terms of our voter registration friendliness. So we went from 10 worst to the 10 best.
That's pretty good stuff.
And so I felt very good about that. Then the next committee I was given to chair was Banks and Banking, which I was like, why did you do that to me? I mean, let me stay at election laws.
Right.
And it turned out that it was a very good move because it was a promotion because it put me in charge of a piece of the economy.
Right.
And I did that for 1.5 years, and then Bill Bulger went to UMass. Tom Birmingham became Senate President, and he gave me the privilege and honor of being the chair of Ways and Means, which was bar none the best political job I had ever had, including Senate President. And I loved Senate President,
Right.
but Ways and Means, because I'm a policy wonk, every piece of legislation goes through the Ways and Means Committee.
So you must really like Elizabeth Warren. She's quite a
Oh,
policy wonk.
she's quite a policy wonk too. I haven't exactly figured out exactly what I'm going to do on all of that,
Right.
but I'm an admirer.
I understand. So at some point you became president of the Senate. How did that come about? How did you become?
I got 17 votes before anybody else.
Oh, okay. I guess that's a good way to do it, right?
So I actually ran for Senate President twice, once in the mid-90s,
Okay.
and I got to 6 votes. And what I would say is whoever gets to 10 first wins.
And that's true?
Because there were so many candidates.
I see.
I figured if you got to 10, they would believe you're going to be the winner, and then everybody else who didn't want to make a decision would instantly make a decision to be with the winner,
Right.
and that would be the one who had the 10 votes.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened.
Isn't that wild?
And the second time I ran for Senate President, and the first time I was it was my own initiative. People were encouraging, but they didn't recruit me. Right. The second time, members came to me and said, "It's your turn. You should run for Senate President, and if you do, I'm going to support you and I will help you." And there was another candidate in that race. In the first race, in the mid-90s, there were 6 of us, I think. The second time, there were 2 of us, so it was a head-to-head fight. And I got to you needed 17 votes to win the caucus at
Right.
the time, and I was the first to get to 10, and then there was a rush toward me, so I had the majority of votes 17 months before the election.
Wow.
Which was extremely early.
I wanted to talk about perhaps one of the most important pieces of legislation, not only in Massachusetts, but probably in the United States, and that was the bill to legalize gay marriage. Can you talk a bit about how it even got started? I'm sure there was a lot of discussion about that.
So this is an amazing example of how our small d democratic system works.
Right.
Legislation to provide domestic partner benefits for same-sex couples was stalled in the legislature, passed the Senate twice, could not move through the House. People got impatient and they said, well, why are we wasting our time on domestic partnership? We should be going for marriage. And bills started to be filed for marriage. And some people outside of the legislature said, we're tired of waiting. If you file bills now, we're not going to see a bill for 10 years get to the governor's desk. We're tired of waiting. 7 couples went to the Supreme Court and said, we have a right to marry under the Equal Protection Clause. The Massachusetts Supreme Court considered the case and by a 1-vote margin said, you're right. You've always had this right under the Equal Protection Clause, so we declare that you can get married. And they turned to the legislature, and the court at that point said, you have 90 days to change whatever laws, if any, that you need to change so that these people can start getting married.
And so the legislator did just that in those 90 days?
The legislature took no action because no action was necessary.
I see.
But there were efforts by constitutional officers to try to block or slow it down. And they did not succeed because city and town clerks started following the law and started doing the marriages. And once the marriages were started, it just unfolded. They couldn't stop it just by these constitutional officers saying, we think there's a problem with this, we think there's a problem with that. And then the next thing that happened was people who opposed marriage filed constitutional amendments to define marriages between a man and a woman.
In the state or nationally?
In the state of Massachusetts.
Okay.
That set off a 3.5-year constitutional convention battle to try to either get it on the ballot by one side or prevent it from getting to the ballot by the other side. And it takes 2 successive legislatures to affirm and move to the ballot a ballot question. And those of us who opposed the constitutional amendment to define marriages between one man and one woman were able to keep the opposition on the ropes for 3.5 years. It included the governor, the speaker, and the Senate president. Now, shorthand, anytime any 2 of them agree, they can almost always get their way.
Right.
When all 3 agree,
wow,
it's a slam dunk. We were able to keep them at bay and outmaneuver them in the convention for 3.5 years. No one who voted for marriage in the first constitutional conventions, in the first term of the 2-term process,
right,
were defeated at the ballot box. And when that election, the next election passed, we had a new governor.
Was it Deval Patrick?
Deval Patrick.
Right.
We had a new speaker, and we had a new Senate president,
right,
all 3 of whom were in favor. When this 3.5-year battle began, there were fewer than 50 of the 101 legislators that were needed to move things through the process. The final vote takes 151 members to keep something off the ballot. And we had 156.
Wow.
So we went from fewer than 50 to more than 150 3.5 years later. Why and how?
I was just going to ask you that. Why and how?
Because the people had the time to reflect on the rightness of the cause.
Right.
And the truth is, there's hardly anybody who doesn't have a friend or a family member, whether they know it or they don't, who is gay.
Right.
And therefore, so many people's eyes opened during that 3.5-year period. And this was a debate between civil law and religious law.
Right.
And the legislature is voted by the public to make civil law and to base their decisions upon the Constitution. And the Constitution has the Equal Protection Clause, which says you can't differentiate between people. We can't treat one group of people one way and another group of people the other way. And so that's why it was always embedded in the Constitution that marriage could occur, but it hadn't because of the law and because of culture, society.
Did it go through the courts again at that point?
No.
No.
No, it never went through a second time.
Right. Now, now nationally, obviously, there was a lot of debate because other states tried to pass similar laws.
Well, every state that went to the ballot defining marriages between a man and a woman passed, which was why we had to fight as hard as we did to keep it from getting to the ballot,
right,
because we had to put the brakes on that. And the way you win that battle is to really reach the hearts and minds of people.
Sure.
And it takes time for people to get their head around something that they learned in church was wrong, or in synagogue, or in mosque was wrong. Except it came into conflict with human nature and what they were experiencing in life. Because they knew gay people, they knew families, they saw families right down the street, and they were just like them. They had the same challenges, the same joys of being in family. And so that's why we were able to win. It took 3.5 years for the legislature to catch up to the public. And then once we did it here in Massachusetts, it was less than a decade before it was national law.
Wow. Whew. Thank you, Stan. That was incredible.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for being on the show, and I want to thank Amherst Media for doing the show. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.